The year was 1986, and my middle school had on top of it an observatory, like one of those dome things that opens up and a telescope, right? Can see out into space. None of us had ever been in it. I don't know anybody that had been in it, but there was a one-time invitation for us to go during the week at night. One of our parents could bring us, and we could look through that telescope and see what? Halley's Comet. The first time in 75 years it was going to be coming around. It's not coming again until 2061. And we had an opportunity. So my dad promised to take me to go do that. Now, 11 years later, my wife and I stood in a church, and we also made a promise. It was not a one-time promise to go see something that came every 75 years. It was a promise to be husband and wife together for hopefully 75 years, right, over and over and over again. Two promises, but very different promises. The promise to go see Halley's Comet, one-time thing, very time-sensitive. Once it passed, 75 years before that can happen again. My dad would have had to have been like 113 the next time it comes around. But then the marriage promises are not so specific. They're specific in what you promise, but they're open-ended in terms of time and the fact that you have to live into them again and again. This is true of the promises we make when we baptize people. We promise to walk alongside them. That's not just something we do once, right? It's something we do again and again and again. So promises can be very specific and time-dependent, or they can be more general and open-ended. Promises can also be conditional or unconditional. Here in our local community here, the Rosen Hotels, Mr. Rosen, I think, has promised to pay for every kid who comes from Tangelo Park who graduates high school to pay for them to go to college. Excellent promise, but they don't let you into college unless you have graduated high school, right? So there's a condition, not necessarily its condition, but a condition they have to meet for that promise to be fulfilled. Because promises by their nature are future-oriented. Some of them, like marriage vows, you have to fulfill again and again and again. But as you fulfill it, it's no longer a promise, it's a realization, right? It's happened. There can be more promises or ongoing promises, but promise is future-facing. So they can be general, specific, open-ended. They can be conditional, unconditional. Some promises aren't good promises. Like if someone promises to do you harm, right? That's a bad promise. But promises can also be hard, just in the fact that we have to wait. So in today's reading from Genesis, Abraham and Sarah hear again the promise that they will have a child and that many nations will come from them. But Sarah was elderly, right? She was well past childbearing age. No doubt most of her adult life she had been treated somehow less than a full woman because she had not bore children, right? And so this promise for her had to be bitter, especially having to wait yet again even after the promise was made. So promises can be hard in that waiting. So you've got this future thing, you've got hard promises. When they get realized, like I said, it's now a reality, not a promise, but sometimes promises get broken. I actually didn't get to see Halley's Comet. Somebody called and offered my dad, I think, tickets to a Cardinal game, of all things. And as I think back on that, maybe it was a business thing, maybe it's something he had to go do, I don't know. I know I didn't go see Halley's Comet, right? So that promise passed. It's no longer a promise, and it didn't get fulfilled, right? So the question that we have with Abraham and Sarah is, how do they live in that time in between the promise being made and the promise being fulfilled? And then we get the story of Mary and Martha. Now, promises sometimes are very articulate, like, I promise to. As they're sitting with Jesus, they too are experiencing promise, but it's a little bit different. Jesus has told all of the disciples that he will die and be raised from the dead. So that's a promise, right? They don't know what that means yet. But then Jesus has promise and is promise. So as they're with him, they may not be able to explain how it's promised, but they know that something of promise is present with them, right? So we've got promise in Abraham and Sarah, and we've got promise with Mary and Martha, but promise is the future, and it's not there yet. So how are they living in between? Well, that then invites us to think about what God promises us, and how do we live in between? Now, what is the promise? Well, it just so happens that today's reading from Colossians tells us the promise. It tells us that Jesus is the firstborn of creation, that Jesus, in him, all things were created, that God was pleased in Jesus for the fullness of God to dwell. And then the promise comes. He's the firstborn from the dead, and God is pleased through Jesus to reconcile the whole creation to God, which means God promises to gather everything that is heaven and on earth up into God. That's a pretty good promise. And it happens, Colossians tells us, through the peace of the cross. Well, that already happened, and Jesus has already been raised from the dead, so in theory, the promise has already been fulfilled, but then we look around, and do we see reconciliation of God everywhere around us? Nope. Right? We look and we see Russia continuing to be at war with Ukraine. We look at our own politics, and we can't even talk to our own family members and neighbors about agreeing on anything. We look at the level of poverty in our communities and the amount of violence that's around us. And some of you can't even get along with your own family people, and reconciliation just inside your own house is hard to do, right? And so we look and say, well, hold on. If the promise was made that all things are reconciled in God, then presumably we should see that now, except for the cross and resurrection have already happened. So is it still a promise? Did it pass by unfulfilled? Is it supposed to be an ongoing one? Are we ultimately going to get there eventually? And I think Scripture tells us that in the fullness of time is when this promise fully gets gathered up. So what we like to say is that we live in the already but not yet. It already has been fulfilled, but it is unfolding, and we are not yet all the way there. And I think both of these stories today can help us understand how we live in the already but not yet, because there's commonalities in the stories. First commonality is that there's an unexpected visitor or visitors. Abraham's just hanging out in the hot part of the day at the tent, and some dusty people walk up, and he runs out. He wasn't expecting them. He runs out, falls on his feet, down on his knees, and says, "Don't pass by. Come, let me wash your feet." And you know he wasn't ready for them, because he has to ask Sarah to quick bake some cakes, which is not quick. And then he has to go get a calf out of the herd and have a servant butcher it and do all that, which is not quick. And he's got to go milk something so he can have milk and curds and the meat and the cakes and get that all to these people. So there's a whole lot of busyness that Abraham has to go about to welcome these unexpected guests. Similarly, our story from Mary and Martha, Jesus rolls into town and ends up at Martha's house. So what is she doing? Oh, somebody's here. She's probably baking. They probably gave him some water to wash his feet, and Martha's doing all of that busyness that hospitality requires. So there's unexpected guests, there's the action of hospitality, but there's another part of hospitality, and that's presence. So when we listen to the story, Abraham, after all of the activity, it says that he stood by while they ate what was provided. So he kept time with them. He sat and stood in presence with them as they were there. That's the part that Mary takes. As Martha is busy with all the action of hospitality, Mary is sitting and just being present with Jesus. Hospitality is both of those things, right? The action and the presence. So unexpected guests, the activity of hospitality, and then the presence of hospitality. And then there's one more thing that's common between these stories, and it has two parts. First, I would say the promise is reiterated, right? Abraham, as the guests are preparing to leave, one of them says, "I will come back, and when I do, Sarah will have had this child," right? So they've already been told the promise a couple of times. It's a reminder that the promise is still there in case Abraham was wondering, or if Sarah was, struggling to see that. In Mary and Martha's case, that reminder of the promise isn't so clear, except for that Jesus says, Mary's chosen this good part of sitting in the presence of the promise, right? Now, the other thing that happens, aside from the promise being reiterated, is that they get to experience something of the divine. These visitors to Abraham, it's not God walking among Abraham, but it is this presence of angelic people, perhaps, these visitors from God, right? So there's this presence of the divine that happens as all of this hospitality unfolds. And in the Mary and Martha story, God is just sitting there in Martha's living room, right? Jesus, God made flesh. So there's this presence of the divine. And so you've got unexpected guests, the action of hospitality, the presence of hospitality, and then in that, they are reminded of the promise and they experience the divine. So perhaps what we can learn from these stories as we live in the time between the promise of all things being reconciled into God and the actuality of that being entirely fulfilled is that what we're supposed to do is offer hospitality. Now, I am not saying that our hospitality is what makes God come into the world. I am not saying that as we take hospitality out into the world, it somehow is what brings us grace. I think hospitality is instead a gift to us from God. Why do I think that? Well, we gather around this table every week, and I stand up here as if I'm the host, right? And we could have someone usher you up here today, and it would seem like they're serving as like hosts as well, getting you to the table like when you go someplace. But who's the host of this meal? Jesus, right? On the night in which he was betrayed, he broke bread, he took the wine, he blessed everything, he fed the disciples, and then he gave it to us as a gift to remember him by and to live into the forgiveness of sins, right? So this table is God's hospitality toward us. Now, in both of those stories that we just heard, we have to imagine that Jesus had dusty feet and his feet got washed. But we know that Abraham got water to wash their feet. We have water right here. And what do we say this water does? Cleanses of our sins, washes us clean. Hospitality, right? We come in here dirty and dusty from the journey, and we get reminded in these waters that we are made clean. That is God's hospitality for us. So every time we gather in this place, we are gathered around the hospitality of the table and the hospitality of these waters of baptism, these visible signs of God's invisible grace. And then we go out into the world. Or even while we're still here, we have opportunities then not to offer hospitality to the unexpected guests because it's required of us or it's somehow something we do to make God's grace come alive, but this hospitality flows through us out into the world. And so when visitors come here and we take an opportunity to greet them, perhaps they were unexpected. We have to do something of the busyness of hospitality, right? Perhaps offer them a bulletin or sit with them and show them how the hymnal works or take them in and get a cup of coffee, right? There's activity, but in that activity, there's also the presence. This is where I think Martha slightly gets it wrong, is that she's not looking for promise, she's just seeing busyness. Abraham's just as busy, but he's still looking for the promise. And because he's looking for the promise, he can be present in the busyness in a way that Martha couldn't just then. Did she still experience the divine? She did. Jesus was still there, right? Did she still get to experience the promise? Absolutely, right? So as we welcome people into this space, every time it's an experience for us of the divine. And I'm not suggesting that out of every 10 people in here, one of them might be Jesus, right? So we should welcome everybody just in case. I think we should welcome everybody because every experience we have with somebody is an experience of God's divinity in the relationships we share in grace with one another. We had a homeless gentleman sleep out in the courtyard a couple of years ago, and he ended up joining us for worship. And he came back the next week, and he had coffee and shared part of his story. Perhaps that's an experience for us of the divine. And it's a reminder of the promise that God's reconciliation gathers up everybody, including people that sleep outside. But then when we leave this place, that hospitality doesn't stay here. And by the way, it's not just for the people that are good at hospitality. If you come to my house, I can promise you I will forget to offer you anything to drink, eat, or otherwise. My wife will. I will not. But that doesn't give me a free pass to say, well, I'm not good at hospitality, so never mind. But when we go out into the world, we encounter the unexpected in people all of the time. When you're at the bank, when you're at the store, the homeless person that's on the corner panhandling, right? The person who is angry at you because you didn't leave the stoplight fast enough, whatever. Like there are so many ways that we encounter people. And I think what these stories remind us is that what we can carry with us everywhere we go is the possibility that as we encounter people, there's some activity of hospitality we can bring. The hospitality of our hearts, the hospitality of our presence, and that in that, we will be reminded of the promise of reconciliation, and we will experience the divine. Because God's promise of reconciliation is, in fact, unfolding around us all the time. if we're focused on the busyness and the stress of it and everything else, we may miss that along the way, but it doesn't mean it's not there. And that's why Abraham runs out of that tent in the hot part of the day, because the promise is coming, and he's going to experience it, not because he's making it happen, but because God continues to show up with us each and every day. So may we be blessed at the hospitality of this table and font to be filled up with that sense of looking for the divine, and go out into the world and look for that presence. And we just might find that it's there all around us because we're looking for it, because it's already ours, whether we feel like that promise has been fulfilled yet or not. Amen.